and we'll move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm Kieran Katira with, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this committee, along with Nancy Lopez, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, but she'll join in the conversation following this. We're going to record this for everyone, you know, and please let us know if that's a problem for you. And I'll go down the list of who's here. So Rachel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. Rachel Gudgel, I'm the staff director of the Legislative Education Study Committee.
Great. And then I have Amy.
Hi all, I'm Amy Whitfield. I'm Special Operations Coordinator for CYFD and also currently staffing the Council for Racial Justice.
Alan?
This is Alan Sanchez. I don't know if you have another Alan, but Alan Sanchez. I'm on the Council for Racial Justice, and I'm the president of CHI St. Joseph's Children.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Arsenio?
Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm Arsenio Romero. I am the superintendent for Deming Public Schools. Thanks for letting me join you this morning. Just want to listen in.
Great. Bill? Jordan?
Morning, everyone. Bill Jordan. I'm with New Mexico Voices for Children. I'm a guest today. Thanks.
Alyssa?
Buenos dias. I'm Elisa Sanchez, and I'm a person born in space in Grant County. And I'm just a little viejita that is an activist that believes in education. So I'm still here.
Great.
Glad to be here.
And Dawn?
Hi, I'm Dawn Iglesias. I'm the Chief Economist for the Legislative Finance Committee.
Great. And Emily?
Good morning, my name is Emily Hoxie. I'm a policy analyst for the Legislative Education Study Committee.
Great. And John?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is John Courtney. I'm Deputy Director at LFC. I oversee our program evaluation efforts here at the Finance Committee.
Great. And Kelly?
Morning, Kelly Clunt. I'm a principal analyst with the Legislative Finance Committee.
And Sienna? Shona? Flanagan, New Mexico PD. Okay. So that's everyone. I think if I've missed anyone, if you want to just quickly introduce yourself.
Gate Bennett Albino Sandoval, tribal advocate and advocate for children with disabilities.
Great. And Tammy.
Sorry, good morning. I'm Tammy. I work at the Office of African American Affairs, and I help with the committee as far as at admin. Thanks.
Great. And we do today have a couple of presentations. It's regarding the permanent land grant, and the Legislative Financial Committee members are going to be here presenting around that as it relates to early childhood education. And then we'll also have New Mexico Voices for Children representative sharing with us. And in between those, we're going to have a little bit of discussion and questions for our guests. And then we have a teacher licensure conversation from PD. And so there'll be questions and answers after that. So there's a lot happening today, and so thankful for our guests sharing with us. As you know, we're trying to make the questions we ask are really to find out how you know, we can make sense of this and make the best case for some of these various proposals, right? So thank you for sharing with us. And maybe we could start with the permanent land grant regarding early childhood education from the Legislative Finance Committee.
Great, thank you. So I think you guys can all see the screen. We've done a joint presentation, Legislative Education Study Committee and the Finance Committee for you guys. And so what we've done is we've put probably more information in these slides than we're going to talk about. But trying to give you a sense of what is the Land Grant Permanent Fund, how it's set up, what's in our Enabling Act, who receives distributions from the Land Grant Permanent Fund, so who are the beneficiaries, and then talk about some of the efforts that have existed over the last decade or so to make distributions for early childhood education, some alternatives to that, and then a landscape of early childhood education programs at the end of this to get a sense of what the need for funding is and what the issues are. So we're going to split this up between the four of us that are here presenting. So Kelly, John, myself, and Dawn. So the first slide talks about the history of the Land Grant Permanent Fund. So when the state became a state, the United States transferred 13.4 million acres to be held in trust for the benefit of common schools and identified state institutions. That represented about 16% of the total lands in the state. So every township had a portion of land designated for the support of common schools, and other tracts of land were designated for the other 20 beneficiaries. What that meant then is, as that land was leased or sold, or revenues were generated on those lands, those revenues came back to the state and get dumped into the Land Grant Permanent Fund to be held in trust for the beneficiaries. The second slide shows you the dollars in the Land Grant Permanent Fund since 2006. So I started working for the legislature permanently in about 2010. You'll note there we were at about a $10.2 billion fund. Currently, we are pushing almost 19 billion. So you'll see the fund has been growing over time. Distributions right now are at a 5% of the prior 5-year average year-end balance. So to figure out the money that gets transferred to the general fund, we look at what the prior 5-year end balances are, average those together, and take 5% of that and then distribute it to the beneficiaries. There's here a couple of slides forward, we'll talk about who the beneficiaries are, but public school districts receive about 86% of the Land Grant Permanent Fund distributions. Public school funding through the funding formula is about $3 billion. So this only covers, I think we're less than 25% of total public school funding. It's funding other institutions like the New Mexico School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, higher ed institutions, hospitals, and some of the correctional institutions. So the fund is funded largely by income, as I noted, from sales, and really and leases, and really it's coming from non-renewable resources such as oil and gas revenues. So leases for oil and gas activity. Last bullet there notes this is one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the country. The second slide, or slide number 4, shows you the changes in the Land Grant Permanent Fund distributions over time. So the last time there was an amendment to the Constitution was in, I believe it was 2003, 2004. And prior to that, we had a 4.7% distribution. That was bumped up permanently, but ramped up to 5.8%. Then it came back down to 5.5%, and now it sits at 5%. The reason for that increased distribution was really to fund education reforms that were part of House Bill 212, primarily the 3-tiered licensure system. So prior to 2003, 2004, the legislature did not have an established minimum salary structure for teachers, and they implemented a minimum salary structure for teachers, put it in statute, and it was costly, and there were concerns about how to fund it. And so the Land Grant Permanent Fund was the distribution was increased primarily to fund that. When the distribution is increased, it's always increased for all of the beneficiaries. So you could technically increase the distribution for a single beneficiary, but because of the way the funds are tracked at the state land office, it makes it somewhat difficult for them. And I think the sense over the last decade or so has been, if you're going to increase the distribution, increase it for all beneficiaries rather than individual beneficiaries. You'll note even that you know, FY17, we're back at 5%. That's a 0.3 percentage point increase from the prior annual, you know, the annual distribution pre-2003 of 4.7%. Clearly, the Land Grant Permanent Fund, as you can see, is providing a pretty consistent funding source for the beneficiaries. It's, you know, been growing all years except for FY01 and FY17, but it generally has a fairly consistent distribution that's been growing going into the general fund. The slide number 5 shows you the list of beneficiaries. I'm not going to go through this. What I will note is I believe it's the State Parks Division actually doesn't get any funds from being a beneficiary, so there were never land set aside. They don't have a share of the fund, but they're a listed beneficiary. Slide number 6 shows you all of the beneficiaries. So the common schools are the public schools. Then you have the higher ed institutions, the special schools, the New Mexico State Hospital, Miners Hospital, and then you get into some of the criminal justice beneficiaries. The balance beginning last year, July 1, 2019, was $18.7 billion. You'll note June 30, 2020, that balance is $18.9 billion. Clearly, there was some impact from COVID on that. I think Dawn could talk to you more about that, but I'm guessing stock market and some of the investments that have happened were impacted with decreasing stock market impact, decreasing investments. Public schools represented, 85.6% of the fund at the beginning of 2019, FY19. At the beginning of 2020, it's over 86%. So this has been a trend you've seen over time, that the portion of the fund that is owned, quote unquote, by public schools has been increasing. We're anticipating, I'm guessing we're anticipating revenue distributions around $800 million for FY21, the current year that we're in. So one of the things that's come up consistently over the last decade is the conversation to increase distributions from the Land Grant Permanent Fund is, can you add a beneficiary to the fund? Beneficiaries are delineated in the Enabling Act, and lands are held in trust by the state, so that any proceeds from the use of those lands are supposed to be used for the named beneficiaries. And there's concern that naming a new beneficiary and allocating lands that were technically allocated to a different beneficiary could be viewed as a breach of trust. Congress has in fact added a beneficiary. They would need to act. So the second bullet there notes that the legislature can't create a new beneficiary. We would need Congress to act on that. In 1996, it took Congress 10 months to get to approve voter-approved amendments to the list of designated Land Grant Permanent Fund beneficiaries. That's the the last time that there have been any changes to the Enabling Act. There's also concern that even with congressional approval, there's potential for legal challenge. So if you think about each of the beneficiaries, if you go back to slide number 6 and you look at each of the beneficiaries owns a certain percent of the fund, creating a new beneficiary and allocating a portion of land or a portion of the fund to that beneficiary takes away from current beneficiaries from their holdings, and there could be legal challenges. For instance, the conversation over the last decade has been to take the portion of the land grant permanent fund that's owned by the common schools, and if you increased a distribution from 5% to 6%, give the additional 1% distribution to either a new beneficiary or allow the schools to keep it, but make them spend it on things that typically fall outside of their purview. And these are hypothetical what ifs. You could have the schools say, no, we're not interested in doing that, and have a legal challenge that they're technically the beneficiary and they shouldn't be forced to spend these dollars that way. There have been over time a couple of different considerations and alternatives, and I think Dawn is gonna talk to you more about these. That I think that the big concern and what folks are interested in is funding early childhood programs, and I think you'll find the legislature is also interested in doing that and finds benefit. Legislative Finance Committee is going to talk about a lot of their work on early childhood programs and the benefit of those programs. I don't think there's any dispute about the benefit of programs. There's been concern about which funding source funds programs and how fast is too fast to ramp up. So there's been some alternatives that have been proposed over the last few years. One is increasing a distribution from the Severance Tax Permanent Fund. Severance Tax Permanent Fund is a constitutional fund, but it doesn't have set beneficiaries. So it doesn't have the hurdle of stepping on the toes of current beneficiaries, nor does it have the hurdle of needing congressional approval. That would only net about $40 million a year, though $40 million a year in growth in programs is not a small amount of funding. The other bullet on here says continue to invest in the Early Childhood Trust Fund. So the legislature this past legislative session put $300 million into, I think it was actually $320 million into a trust fund specifically for early childhood programs. And the idea here is continue to put money into the trust fund so that the distributions from the trust fund would grow over time. And I think Kelly or Dawn, you guys are taking it from here to talk more in detail, correct?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I'll take it from here. If you wouldn't mind going back to the previous slide really quick, one point that I would like to make before we move on to the Early Childhood Trust Fund is the slide on the Severance Tax Permanent Fund, or the options, the different options, yes. So one thing to note about using the Severance Tax Permanent Fund, Rachel is absolutely correct that it doesn't have the same hurdles in terms of who the beneficiaries are, but because it is a much smaller fund, it would yield not only a smaller distribution, but that fund faces some other challenges in its own growth that the Land Grant Permanent Fund doesn't face. So the Land Grant Permanent Fund receives a pretty steady source of contributions from oil and gas activity that occurs on these entrusted lands. So particularly it gets royalty contributions for oil and gas production, and that's made contributions into the fund of anywhere on average between $200 and $600 million each year is newly contributed into the fund on top of its investment earnings. And in in 2019, it actually contributed $900 million with the boom in oil and gas production. So the Land Grant Permanent Fund can grow and is growing in a way that the Severance Tax Permanent Fund cannot grow. So the severance tax permanent fund, other than its own investment earnings, has received much fewer contributions into the fund. It can only receive contributions of what's left over in the severance tax after that severance tax has been bonded against. So whatever is left over in the severance tax bonding fund is transferred each year. And for example, in 2017, contributions were as low as $17. They bonded the entire amount of the fund. The same will be true for FY20, where the balance of the bonding fund was swept and was kept from being able to be distributed into the severance tax permanent fund. So it does have contribution limitations and growth limitations. So that $5 billion a year, an increased contribution to it does put it more at risk in terms of maintaining the corpus of the fund, because it's not getting the same amount of contributions aside from interest earnings that the land grant permanent fund is getting. So I just wanted to note that point. And now for the Early Childhood Trust Fund, if we'll go to the next slide. So in the 2020 regular session, the legislature passed House Bill 83. Can we go to the next slide?
I am not able to go to the next slide for some reason. I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
I got nothing here.
Maybe try hitting your space bar.
Okay, there we go.
So House Bill 83 in the 2020 regular session, it created what it called the Early Childhood Education and Care Fund, and it's been referred to as the Early Childhood Trust Fund. So this fund was created with the idea that it would capture some of the volatile oil and gas revenues and allow those to be redistributed for the benefit of early childhood education. So it started with an endowment. The original endowment was $320 million. However, after the pandemic hit at the close of the session, in the June 2020 special session, that $320 million endowment was reduced to $300 million, but that endowment did still occur at the end of FY20. And then aside from that endowment, the idea was that it could either receive future endowments, so future appropriations from the general fund of lump sums of money, but it would also have two revenue streams that would capture any windfall oil and gas revenue. So the first one that is dedicated solely to the oil and gas, or excuse me, dedicated solely to the Early Childhood Trust Fund is federal mineral leasing payments. These are bonus and royalty payments for production on federal lands. And it's set aside so that if the state receives any funding in federal mineral leasing payments that are in excess of the 5-year average, so if it has boom years, then that excess of the 5-year average will be transferred directly to the Early Childhood Trust Fund. And please forgive this flow chart. There's an extra line that's supposed to be drawn from, does the federal mineral leasing exceed the 5-year average? If the answer of that is yes, then that transfer goes to the Early Childhood Trust Fund. Now, if there is no excess of the 5-year average, which would occur during bust years, then no additional distribution is transferred so as to maintain the solvency of the general fund. Now, additionally, it can also receive funding from the oil and gas emergency school tax, though this one is a little more nuanced because there is already a beneficiary, so to speak, of the emergency school tax, which is the state's rainy day fund. So currently in the 2017 session, the legislature said if anything is received in excess of the 5-year average for the oil and gas emergency school tax, then that excess would go to the state's rainy day fund. And the state's rainy day fund, because of the oil and gas boom, actually grew relatively quickly, and the state was reaching a pretty high reserve level. So as part of this legislation, this said, okay, if there is an excess of a 5-year average, then instead of sending all of it necessarily to the state's rainy day fund, first take a look and see how big our general fund reserves are. And if general fund reserves are already 25% of recurring appropriations, then instead of putting more in general fund reserves with this excess funding, send that excess funding to the Early Childhood Trust Fund instead. And then you'll notice this flow chart has one additional little nuance, and this was just to cover any years where maybe the reserves are almost 25%, but not quite. In that case, whatever is excess of the 5-year average for emergency school tax, a portion of it could be sent to the rainy day fund, otherwise known as the tax stabilization reserve. It could be sent to that in order to get to 25%, and then anything, if there's left over from that, could then be transferred to the Early Childhood Trust Fund. Now, prior to the pandemic, and more specifically for these revenue sources prior to the oil market crash that came after the pandemic, this fund had the potential to receive over $575 million in distributions from these two revenue sources between FY21 and FY24. So without any additional endowments, it was expected over the next 4 years or so that because of the oil and gas boom, these two revenue sources were expected to exceed their 5-year averages. The state already had 25% in reserves, so this fund was expected to receive some pretty sizable contributions. However, as is the case with volatile oil and gas revenues, when the oil market crashed, the contributions from these revenues are no longer expected to exceed their 5-year average. So in order to maintain solvency of the general fund, there's not going to be any additional distributions. So it does appear in the next few years that distributions from these two revenue sources will be unlikely, unless, of course, there is an unexpected rebound in the oil market. Now, that doesn't mean that the fund can't receive additional funding. There could be additional appropriations or endowments that are separate from these two revenue sources. But these two revenue sources are unlikely to generate some revenue for the fund in the next couple of years due to the nature of the oil and gas market and the current crash. If we can move on to the next slide. I'll go over really quickly what the impact of increasing the land grant permanent fund distribution from 5 to 6% would be. This has been a pretty common proposal for the last few years, and it would have the general effect of increasing the permanent fund distribution, but that increase would only, above what it would normally distribute, that increase only happens in the near term, and in the long term it has a negative cost to the fund. So, and not only a negative cost to the fund, but a negative cost to what the general fund distribution would be otherwise. So in order to explain that, you can see this chart. There's a lot of numbers here, but I'll highlight some of the key pieces for it. So you'll notice at the very right-hand two columns, you see an amount that says if the permanent fund distribution was increased from 5% to 6%, in this hypothetical situation, that increase would begin in FY22. Now, because it requires constitutional amendments, it's unlikely that we could get an FY22 distribution. But in this scenario, just to show the difference for the fund, it assumes an FY22 increase. And it would distribute about $180 million additional dollars overall, and that's about 160 million or so additional dollars to the general fund, or I would say additional dollars to common schools, or to that permanent school fund distribution. However, you'll notice that that distribution of about $160 million is only for about 7 years in terms of additional funding over what the general fund would otherwise already be getting from its 5% distribution from the permanent fund. So it only consistently provides that $160 million for about 7 years. And then after that 7-year-ish period, it's going to start providing diminishing returns over time compared to the current allocation. And so after 15 years, the additional funding from this increased distribution would actually be less than 100 million rather than 160 million. And it would decrease by about 10 million or so each year thereafter. So that after 25 years, you'll notice this pink highlighted line on the table, the Land Grant Permanent Fund would actually be distributing a smaller amount than it would have been distributing under the 5% distribution. So in terms of allocating a consistent new revenue source, it does so in the near term, but it does have a long-term cost. And so if there were a consistent amount of new dollars that were dedicated, in theory, to be paid for from this distribution, then because this distribution would provide diminishing returns over time compared to what it would otherwise provide, then presumably it would be eating into the growth of additional, of other programs. Now, this idea of the, or this point of the tipping point, which is this demonstration that the fund would produce less in the long term than it would currently. This did occur with the 2003 amendment. So if the 2003 amendment, which took the distribution, as Rachel said, up to 5.8% and then 5.5 and then 5.5%, or excuse me, 5.0%, then if that distribution had never occurred, as of FY17, the general fund would be getting $25 million a year more than it would have gotten, than it did get. So in the original FIR for that distribution, this tipping point and the year for 2017 was predicted, and that was indeed accurate. In 2017, the difference of the 5% of the current distribution from the permanent fund was actually $25 million less than what the distribution would have been if it had been kept at 4.7% the whole time. And then that difference, because of the growth of the fund, that difference grows each year. So each year currently will be receiving fewer dollars from these distributions than would have been received under a 4.7% scenario had that change never happened. Under this current scenario of going from 5 to 6%, you can see that by 2060, the Land Grant Permanent Fund, the value of that fund would be about $20 billion less than what the value of that fund would be under current distributions. And the general fund would receive about $350 million less than it would have received under a 5% distribution from a larger corpus. So increasing the current distribution does provide additional funding in the near term, but it has a longer term cost. And so there is a trade-off in terms of benefit now versus benefit later. And with that, I will turn it over to, I think, Kelly to discuss the rest of the presentation on early childhood programs.
Thank you, Dawn and Rachel. So Rachel gave you a nice background of the history of the fund and some of the possible considerations, alternatives, and legal challenges. And Dawn gave you a realistic look at financial concerns going forward. So I'm going to go over what early childhood system looks like now for the state of New Mexico. I'm going to do most of the presentation, but I do want to note that Dr. John Courtney is with us today. He's our Deputy Director of Evaluation here at LFC. He's been the spearhead of much of our research here, and he's a real brain trust. So if there's some in-depth questions about any of the research, we're lucky to have him here today, and I wanted to recognize him and thank him for making the time. So this first slide is basically a visualization of the early childhood system in New Mexico, the public system in New Mexico. And the way you read this chart is you see that like pinky purple arrow at the top, that's the age range of children. And the boxes below are the large programs by name, and they range from the age range of that arrow that they serve. So for instance, child care assistance, you'll notice, starts right after birth, a few weeks old, and it can go all the way up to age 13, so beyond that arrow. And home visiting is our next program. Home visiting, actually, let me go back a second just to make sure everybody understands what child care assistance is. So child care assistance provides payment for parents so they can put their child in a child care setting, and you have to be below 200% of the federal poverty line, and the parent or caregiver has to also have a qualifying activity, either working or going to school. So income and qualifying activity, you can use this program to subsidize your childcare costs with a childcare provider licensed by the state. And again, that starts the first few weeks after the child is born and goes into their teenage years. The next program is our home visiting program. This program starts prenatally. Hopefully we engage with the mother before the baby is born, because then we can look at some health outcomes for the mother, like, you know, making sure she's not diabetic, or doing some safety checks in the home, or connecting her to food programs, lots of other things going on in home visiting. And that usually, depending on the model, can last through age 3 to age 4. It changes, so that gets a little bit fuzzy. We have the Women, Infants, Children program, also known as WIC, IDEA Part C and IDEA Part B. We mostly use that for developmental delays or disabilities. Then you have the Head Start and Early Head Start program. I would note that these are totally federally funded. So unlike all of the other programs that you see on this chart, the state does not appropriate Head Start or Early Head Start dollars. That actually goes directly from the feds to the providers, so the state has very little control over those dollars and allocations. Then you'll have our pre-K and early pre-K programs, which start at age 3 for some and go to age 4. And then our K-5 Plus program, which is an extended learning program. And so that's what we consider our early childhood system in New Mexico. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of an overview of kind of what we're looking at on our early childhood population. These two charts are really important for 2 reasons. You'll notice that the first chart shows our declining population, meaning we have to look at the balance as we're building up these programs. As we go up for years, the population is going to go down. We can't overbuild it so we have more slots eventually than children. We have to really look at the balance of what children are going to be in the system going forward. And then this pie chart you're going to see on the right hand shows that our Medicaid births. So 3 of every 4 births in New Mexico are supported by Medicaid, which is going to be important when we're thinking about home visiting on a slide later on in leveraging possible federal Medicaid dollars. Next slide, please. So this is some important research. I'm not going to go too far in depth with it, but I just wanted to note that New Mexico at-risk children start behind and often stay behind their peers, from what our research shows. But I would note that even though they start behind and they tend to stay behind, each one of those children are still seeing a year of growth in their education. It's just that their peers who are not starting behind are also receiving that year of growth. And so what we know is in the classroom is happening is they are receiving that year of growth, but we're not necessarily bridging the gap between at-risk children and their counterparts who do not necessarily face some of the same at-risk environments. I'd also note that COVID is expected to exacerbate this issue. We still have more research to look at going for years. I'm sure that's going to be a big public question and research question for many years. This has been a really tough time for children and families. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is early childhood funding over the last, since FY12. So what you're going to see in this chart is by program, that very first slide that we went through, I went through all of the types of programs. These are their funding sources over the last few years. And what you're going to see in this chart is that since FY15, not even 12, in which this stacking chart shows, but just since FY15, we've increased funding in this state for early childhood programs 103%. And you're going to see that it's almost at $450 million versus an FY12 where we weren't even at $150 million. So early childhood funding has grown exponentially throughout the last few years in this state, and that's mostly been done with state general fund And I would note that this chart even doesn't include two other main early childhood funding sources, which is Head Start. I noted earlier that the state doesn't allocate the dollars, and so we didn't put that in this chart, but that's another almost $73 million in funding for early childhood funding on top of this almost $450 million in the current fiscal year. And this chart doesn't include another $43 million in WIC funding that goes to families. So the funding is even beyond this, closer to over 500 million. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, I'm going to go over each of these programs a little bit more in depthly, and they're all built the same. So I hope everyone could just pay attention to a couple things on this slide. We have the name of the program, a small definition below it, and then there's going to be a box on the left side upper corner that gives you the current year operating budget, the estimated capacity. We also have some state research or national research in these slides. And so with that, we're going to start with pre-kindergarten. So that's early education for 3 and 4-year-olds. The current year operating budget is over $100 million. That's split between public and private providers. So private providers are childcare centers or home settings, and the public schools are the other settings. So you have what we call, and now the word is, I want to say bifurcated, but that's not right. It's a mixed delivery system, so that families have a choice. And that's really important for a few reasons. Say a family has younger children and they'd like their oldest child, a 4-year-old, to go to a pre-K setting. It might be more convenient for that family to choose a child care center so that all of their children could be enrolled at the same center together, versus a family who maybe have older children where their 4-year-old could go to the same school that their older siblings. So it adds to a little bit of agility in the system. It also adds, some providers do not want to, public school providers may not want to bring in 3-year-olds for early pre-K, and so private providers have been allowed to pull up a lot of that capacity. And so what I would note in our pre-K program in the state is our research has shown some really promising effects that some pre-K programs in the nation haven't. And so we're actually being really successful in the state on our implementation of pre-K. And some of the things that we've noted year over year in our research of our pre-K in the state is 11% of, there's an 11% increase in the graduation rate for English learners and lower income participants. There's improved reading and math scores from kindergarten through the 11th grade. There's 50% reduction in grade retention, 25% reduction in chronic absenteeism. There's a higher rate of exiting special education. And we're noting about a $6 to $1 return on investment for our research on our pre-K investment in this state. And so those are actually really impressive results when you look at how other states are looking at their long-term impacts of pre-K. Many states are seeing that there's a fade-out effect of their pre-K by the 3rd grade, and we're actually seeing that this is going much long-term for our state, which is really promising. Okay, the next slide, please. I'll probably go a little faster. I think we're running out of time. So childcare assistance, I explained already how that goes. It's got an operating budget right now of $158 million. It serves about an average between 20 and 22,000 children every single month. I will note, obviously, those capacities are much less now given restrictions due to the pandemic. Some of the research we have found at LFC regarding childcare participation, we've noted some increased family income, about $3,500 a year for the family, some increased well child visits, and increased dental visits from participation in childcare assistance. I would note on the chart on the left, we're also spending a lot more per child than we have historically in the past. So because the state decided that child care assistance, the initial inception of childcare was so that families could work or go to school. It was really thought of to be like an economic support program. And the nation decided that while we had all of these kids in care, it was a real opportunity to also give them some early ed. And so we shifted this major program not only to be an economic support, but also to be an educational support and getting some of that support to children really early. And so to pay for that quality, the state has increased reimbursement significantly. So you'll note that they've gone over almost 100% rate increases for infants since FY12, and we broke it out by age range there. So we're paying a lot more per student in order to get better outcomes. Some more research needs to be done on if we're actually getting any educational outcomes. Next slide, please. So home visiting, I noted earlier when we talked about the population born on Medicaid, this is probably one of the biggest opportunities the state has leveraging more dollars from the feds to increase early childhood in this state. So the state is piloting a Medicaid funded home visiting pilot, and basically we could match $1 to $3 of state general fund to pay for home visiting. And since so many babies are born on Medicaid, it allows us to really capture a lot of those births. And so this is a real opportunity to bring in federal revenue to the state without necessarily having to even increase home visiting general fund dollars any more than we already have. We already have sufficient general fund dollars invested in home visiting that we could leverage millions and millions of federal dollars more, probably 100 million more, because we almost put in, I think it's close to 20 million at this point. 15 million of state general fund that can be matched three to every dollar we put in. So that's a real opportunity. The next slide, please. Can we go to, yeah. So here's a slide on the Head Start and Early Head Start. I noted earlier that it was almost 73 million. It provides about 7,400 slots, so children receiving care through these programs in the state. The chart on the left shows that the state is not meeting the federal requirement for teachers with a bachelor, and so the federal requirement is about 50%. National average is over 70%, and New Mexico is far below that in the 30%. So there's some work that needs to be done to help Head Starts with that piece of quality. Next slide. This is a slide on our K-5 plus. It's our extended school year. We're right now spending 79.9 million. It has a total capacity of 64,000. However, only 16,000 slots were applied for this year. So there's some growth that we could do. And I think the important part about this slide is the next slide, actually. Let me turn you over to the next slide. So we try to look at what stacking of programs did for children in the long run. And what we found was that high quality K-5 plus combined with high quality pre-K, if a child received both of those programs together, stacking, they had a compounding effect, which almost completely reduced the achievement gap between low-income students and their counterparts who were not low income. And so I think that's a really important note, that these programs need to be high quality and they need to work together in order to really break that achievement gap that we talked about at the beginning of the slideshow. And finally, if we go to my last slide. Okay, all of the spending that we've done, there it goes, all of the spending we have done. So this chart, what it does is estimate capacity from 0 to 4 for all those programs that we just talked about. Now, what you're gonna see is that top blue line is our total cohort per age. Then the orange line below it is 80%, which is what most states use as their line to consider early childhood universal, because we know that there's about 20% of the population that probably will not enroll their kids early for reasons that are always the parents make personal to the family. And so what you're going to notice is that we've invested heavily in services for 3- and 4-year-olds, and between child care assistance, Head Start, pre-K, and city and town funded early education, that we're at almost 80% of 4-year-olds having some type of service available to them in total slots. And you notice the 3s are really growing on there as well. But once we get down to the early ages, 0, 1, 2, that those aren't necessarily as covered as the 3- and 4-year-old population. I will note that this stacking doesn't necessarily account for if families may be enrolled in childcare and pre-K, and so you have 2 slots there by 1 child. We did estimate that that's probably less than 20% of families who are utilizing those programs that way. And so what we look at when we're looking at early childhood funding is we have broad coverage for a big portion of 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds and very little for the youngest of ages. And with that, we will stand for questions.
Okay, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have time for questions because we're over. We have another presenter that's going to have to go, which is going to be Bill. So just table your questions for right now and let him go, and we'll have to go towards the end. So Bill, I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the invitation, and I want to thank the LFC and LESC staff for their presentation this morning and their work. And I really want to thank all of you for serving on this incredibly important task force. And I also want to just say that I'm aware that I'm a white male presenting on racial equity. And I want to say that I hope I can be helpful in your deliberations. My name is Bill Jordan. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor with New Mexico Voices for Children. We're a nonpartisan advocacy organization whose mission is to improve child and family well-being. I've been with Voices for 22 years and fighting over funding for early care and education for 20 of those years. We're the ones at Voices who have the misfortune of releasing the National Kids Count rankings each year that shows that in the last several years we dropped to 50th in the nation in child well-being. In my first few years with Voices, I remember going to the Roundhouse and asking for funding for various education and health and human service programs for kids, and mostly being told no. Lawmakers would say, "Where do you expect us to get the money?" So we realized that we had to become the experts in where to get the money. And now most of our work as a child advocacy organization is on the state budget and tax policy. And we always try to bring a racial equity lens to that work. So I appreciate the invitation to be able to speak to you about the future of our kids, money, and racial equity. So how are the kids? Not good. As I said, New Mexico is 50th in child well-being and in educational outcomes. So how's the money? Really, really, really good. New Mexico has the second largest permanent fund in the nation at almost $20 billion. So how's racial equity? Not good. New Mexico's racial disparities and inequities are so bad that the state recently lost the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit, forcing the state to acknowledge what many of us had been saying for years, namely that due to a lack of support and investment in the programs that we know will create opportunities for them to thrive, children of color continue to experience some of the worst child well-being outcomes in the entire nation. So as I said, we'd go up to the Roundhouse and ask for additional funding, and we were constantly told there wasn't enough to expand or improve early care and education. We were told that tax increases were off the table and they wouldn't raise taxes to get the money needed to help our kids. Let me just say that the new Early Childhood Fund is a great idea. We absolutely supported that, but it was established less than a year before we began to take money out of it to help balance the budget. It's a very small fund with a very small return that will go back into early childhood programs. So as Voices for Children began to look for non-tax options for raising revenue, we were especially excited about the promising research on early care and education programs, but we knew that those programs were going to be costly. The science was telling us that learning begins at birth or before, but our state budget hawks said that they wouldn't start funding our children's education until kindergarten. The science was telling us that 85% of brain development happens in the first 3 years, but the state budget hawks said, no, we're going to start funding education at age 5. Meanwhile, the evidence for early childhood as an investment was compelling and growing. Nobel laureate economists were telling us that high quality ECE programs would provide a 10-to-1 return on investment. In 2010, maybe the worst year of the Great Recession for New Mexico, that word investment led us to look at the state's land grant permanent school fund. Instead of looking at tax revenue to fund ECE, we began to look at the state's sizable investment accounts and began making the case that investing the permanent fund in our own children was a better investment in the long term than investing in Wall Street. Economists were telling us the return on investment for early childhood was as much as 10-to-1. So let me talk for a moment about the permanent school fund. It was established by Congress when New Mexico became a state. Congress took land that belonged to Native Americans and Hispanic land grants and gave it to the newly formed state of New Mexico and said we were to use that land to help pay for the state's schools, universities, hospitals, and prisons. That's still the way it is today, with the public schools getting about 86% of the financial benefit. The state land office manages the trust funds, and the state investment council invests those funds primarily in Wall Street. Every year, 5% of the fund is transferred to the state budget to be used for the benefit of the schools, universities, hospitals, and state prisons. Meanwhile, the fund continues to grow in two ways. First, from money that comes in from the use of the land, primarily gas and oil leases, and second, from the return on investments in the fund. Overall, the fund grows at an average of about 11% a year. And as I said, only 5% a year is transferred to the state budget for schools, universities, hospitals, and prisons. So the fund continues to grow a lot, even though we're taking 5% of it every year and transferring it to the state budget. All of that brings us to the proposal we're talking about today, to amend the Constitution so that instead of taking 5% of the fund every year, we would take 6%, with that extra 1% going to ECE programs. So if the legislation were to pass, there would likely be over $150 million a year more available for these programs. Money that would be used to expand home visiting and pre-K for all of our kids, and to improve the quality of childcare and make it much more affordable for many more families. I want to repeat that the fund grows at an average of 11% a year, so that taking 6% a year still allows the fund to grow significantly over time. The other thing I want to point out is that our understanding of education has changed over the last 110 years. And our practice of education has changed too. 110 years ago, the schools started out as a few elementary grades, expanded to high school, and was recently expanded to include kindergarten. We're not asking for a change in the beneficiaries. We're expanding the definition of education to include the early years. Just as kindergarten was added a few years ago, we want to add the earlier years where we know most of brain development occurs. What this legislation is basically doing is expanding the definition of education to what modern day brain science tells us is true, that learning begins at birth, actually before birth. That in fact, 85% of brain development happens in the first 3 years of life, but our investment in education starts at 5. Frankly, that's not the best use of our education dollars, and it certainly is not following the science. Now, to our credit, New Mexico has recognized that and begun to expand pre-K and home visiting, and also begun to improve the quality of childcare. The problem is that we're a couple $100 million short of serving all of our kids. And expansion of those programs is going painfully slow, leaving most of our kids behind, And that effort for expansion is going to be thwarted yet again now by the current recession. Let me return to the issue of equity. When over 75% of our babies and toddlers are kids of color, and we deny most of them access to early care and education, that furthers racial inequities. Those inequities have been found by the New Mexico courts to be harmful to kids of color and to result in worse outcomes. In the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit, the state was ordered to reverse its policy of funding education and teaching in ways that perpetuate structural racism. Essentially, it said that the way our education budget was designed constituted structural racism. Preschool, pre-K was a part of that lawsuit. Because the state has repeatedly failed to raise the revenue needed to expand early childhood programs, and we now find ourselves in another recession, this legislation is saying enough. We will use a different source of funds to make sure that our kids and families are served, and we won't wait another 20 years to roll it out. This legislation asks that lawmakers give the people a chance to vote on whether they want to invest their land grant permanent fund in our youngest children instead of the stock market. Because it is a constitutional amendment, it has to pass the House and Senate and then be approved by the voters. Taking it to the voters gives us an opportunity to also educate voters and parents about the importance of early care and education. One of the great things about early childhood is that it makes it so effective is that it is a two-generation approach. It involves the parents as much as the child, especially home visiting. So the parent education, that two-generation approach, is another really positive aspect of ECE. A lot was already said about pre-K and home visiting and their positive impacts by the LFC presentation, but what I wanted to do was just speak a little bit to childcare. When the federal government passed welfare reform in the 1990s, the Child Care Assistance Program was thrown in to try to sweeten the pot for those who were not happy with welfare reform. The thinking was that if the government ended welfare as we know it and forced people to go to work, some of them would need child care as a work support. Some of you will remember that welfare reform itself has its roots in racist stereotypes. Since child care was funded as a welfare program, it was never intended to be anything more than a safe place for a child to go while mom went to work. It was never designed and certainly never funded to be a child development program. As a result, child care has never been adequately funded. The fact that so many low-wage parents need child care to go to work and that so many women of color own or work in the child care industry compounds the racist story of the child care program. As a result, we now have a child care system that is grossly underfunded, falling short in serving our children, and keeping child care workers in poverty. Child care in New Mexico also has a history of being funded as a work support. What's worse is that it's recently been evaluated as a school prep program. It was never intended to be that. It was certainly never funded to be that or to achieve those kinds of results. Now, however, with the recognition that early brain development is so critical in those early years, there is now a greater focus on improving the quality of child care. This is a very important development, but it costs a lot of money. And the state and federal government have yet to fund the program to achieve those results that we want. So including high-quality childcare in the use of the land-grant permanent funds is essential and will help us redefine childcare as a program that, although it has its roots in a racist welfare reform, can now be a key part of a plan to reverse the structures of oppression and injustice. I want to be clear. It's not that our kids are failing. It's that we are failing our kids. And there's every reason to believe that the constructs of racism and discrimination are a major reason for the racial disparities in child well-being, whether in education, healthcare, or economic security. We have especially failed our kids in those first few years of life when child development is so critically important. Think about it. The reason that ECE provides a 10-to-1 return on investment is that when the kids get a good start in life, fewer of them need special ed, fewer of them end up in the justice system, and their earnings later in life are much higher. Now, flip that around. The fact that we've not funded ECE and not made it available to all of our kids means that we have increased the likelihood that they will need special ed, that they will not do well in school, that they will be more likely to end up in trouble with the law and have lower earnings throughout their lifetime. When 75% of our kids are kids of color, when New Mexico has money for corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the rich, but then claims that there's not enough of a budget to give all of our kids a good start in life, that is institutional racism. New Mexico's demographic changes tell us that the younger the child, the more likely he or she is to be from a family of color. And yet it is our youngest kids that we're leaving behind. Let me be clear. I want to be really clear about this. I'm not accusing anyone of being racist. There are intentional racist policies like redlining, like voter suppression. But I believe this has been unintentional. We didn't know until a few years ago that what we were doing might not be, that what we were doing or not doing might be causing harm to our kids by not giving them the best opportunity for success. But now we know what works. We know who will benefit the most. And we have an opportunity to fix it. And we have the money. The question is whether we will do it. With changes in the legislature, the changes of passage are better than ever. This year, we have an opportunity to dramatically change one of the structures of oppression and injustice, to be anti-racist in our actions, and to make racial and ethnic and gender equity a priority for our kids and families. There was a time when maybe we didn't know better. We didn't know the science of early child development, but now we know. We know the return on investment is higher when we invest our kids than when we invest in Wall Street. We know we're a poor state sitting on a massive $20 billion land grant permanent fund that is targeted for our kids' education, but not using it where it could do the most good in those early years. We now know that denying them a nurturing start in life will mean that they will not do as well in school, that they will earn less throughout their lifetime, and they're more likely to end up in trouble with the law. We're using the land grant permanent fund to pay for the state prison. We're using it to pay for the consequences of not giving our kids a good start in life, when we could be using that fund at the front end of a child's life for early care and education to help keep them out of that state prison. There's something insidious about saying that the prison complex will someday house some of the children. and that's worthy of funding for the land grant permanent fund. But our youngest and most vulnerable are not worthy of those funds. As a parent and a grandparent, I have to say that for me, it feels obscene. It's just wrong that our treatment of children is the worst in the nation while we're sitting on a $20 billion fund that was established for them. This proposal flips the narrative. It takes a 100-year-old institution like the Land Grant Permanent Fund that is deeply rooted in a racist history and flips it over, turns it inside out. Let it be the investment that gives our children of color the best shot at a brighter future. Let's be bold. Let this be one of those major initiatives that rights the wrongs of institutional racism, that helps dismantle the structures of oppression and injustice. It's not enough to be race neutral. We need to be anti-racist, make up for the wrongs of the past. And I believe that means going big. Investing in our children and families is one of the best, most impactful and enduring ways to do that. In January, we have an extraordinary opportunity in front of us. With a new legislature, we have an opportunity to do what we haven't been able to do for the last 10 or 20 years. Thanks. I'll leave it at that and be happy to answer any questions that you all might have.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. So we will open up questions, knowing there's only a few minutes. We have a question already from Alan.
Yes, it'll be short. It's a question, but it's also, I think, for our council, that you're a subcommittee of the Council for Racial Justice. So putting on the lens, looking for the racial justice in using the Land Grant Permanent Fund. So we've heard some red herrings today, which I was disappointed that would be given, and I want to point those out. For instance, saying that we have to go to Congress. We don't believe we do, but if we did, that's a hurdle, not a roadblock. Another red herring is that in 2044, if we don't use the fund, it would have 49 billion. If we use the fund at 6%, it'll have 37 billion. That's twice the amount of money that's in the fund today, and we're not projected to have twice the population. So why would we need the larger fund? The racial equity in this is that, or the discrimination in the fund, the way the distribution formula works today, is that it's being used to keep taxes low for the rich. In 2003, when they could not find money to have retention for teachers and to pay the teachers, they went to the fund, okay? In the same year, we gave away half of the personal income tax, state personal income tax. Who benefited? The rich. There's the racial institutional racism there. There's, we start seeing it. Intentional or not, it happened. So we give away $500 million to the rich, and yet we'll use the Land Grant Permanent Fund. It's subsidized. So it's a supplant of money. That's a supplant. So then the other red herrings that we get is that there'll be lawsuits. Folks on this council, I've worked on a lot of controversial legislation for the last 20 years, and every one of them has a threat of legislation. That is no reason not to vote for something because there's a threat of a lawsuit. You know, if there's a threat of a lawsuit, that's not arguable for a reason not to do the right thing. So when the state office, the Legislative Finance Council comes forward, they're saying there's going to be less money. Well, if I don't pay my mortgage, you know, I could have more money in my savings. If I don't feed my children, I could have more money in my savings. Well, of course, the fund isn't going to grow as fast, but we don't need it to grow as fast because the investment's needed today. And when they say it's less 49 to 37, that's 12 billion. It's not like we burn that money. That money's invested in another investment, which has a greater return than the stock market, which is our children. This is the other red herring. They say we're spending 5%. and that no one should ever spend over 5%. The IRS requires nonprofits, if you have a trust like St. Joe's, we have a $100 million trust. We take no government money, disclaimer. You are obliged to spend at least 5%. And the state's not spending 5% of that fund because we use a 5-year rolling average. If you do the math, in the last 10 years, we've never spent over 4%. The average is something like 3.7 because we have a 5-year rolling average, and we make the distributions every month. So by the time you're at the end of the year of that distribution, it's even lower. This is possible. There's red herrings that have been infiltrated into the arguments from our Legislative Finance Council, and we need to remove those. You need to remove the arguments of lawsuit. That's not your purview. You need to remove the argument that we're spending 5%. You got to be honest. We're spending 5% of a 5-year rolling average. Today, 11% comes in. We're spending 4% of the 11. This is very doable, but the racial lens that you have to use as members of this council is the equity. We can have the largest turnaround in equity for children. Lands that were stolen, and there's no intergenerational wealth being passed down because it was stolen to the state, and the most vulnerable populations can't use the funds from lands that were stolen from them. That's the racial equity lens that we're looking for. Thank you for listening to.
Thank you so much, Alan. Any other questions? Alyssa. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Alan, muchas gracias. And I want to thank everybody, but Alan, that was unbelievable. And Bill, you were outstanding too. One of my concerns with the early childhood education, as it is with all of the education in New Mexico, is that basically it's a white system that all of us had been put into. And we learn how to hate ourselves or not be accepting of who we are because we don't see anything about us that's represented in that school system. And so when we talk about early childhood education, we need to put the equity lens starting there. It doesn't do us any good to put a whole bunch of kids into pre-K so that they can learn how to hate themselves at an earlier age. I'm sorry, this is really emotional for me because I started in school in 1944. And one of the things I learned was how to lie about who I was in order to be acceptable in that school system. But thankfully, my parents were strong enough to help me survive as a Chicana. And I hate to see kids just put into a system, but not that who they are is valued and honored.
Mm-hmm. So, as a whole, can give us some insights on. One of them is quality early childhood education should have an equity lens, right?
Absolutely.
When we're talking quality, and the rest of it, the slides that were shown regarding the numbers, even for someone like me who's still learning about those, they looked off, right? The numbers didn't look in terms of the return on investment as well. It's making the assumption that having early childhood education isn't going to benefit our economy. It's making the assumption that there's literally no return on investment, and also there's a hit to our state of not having early childhood education financially because we don't have early childhood education, and the return on investment. So how do we get tighter numbers? I think that is something that needs to happen. Any one of the panelists want to jump in regarding
So
this.
I'll take that, or John Courtney could take that. We actually did have a slide about the return on investment for each one of these programs, and we took it out knowing the presentation was already a little bit long. So we do have a lot of research, but on average, we're seeing, John, correct me if I'm wrong, on average $3 return on investment to one across the whole system. And it depends, like it might be $6 to one for pre-K.
Yeah, you know, Kelly's right on that, and I would add that you know, each program is going to see different results. Each program is different in nature. The other thing to keep in mind about return on investment numbers, which, as Kelly mentioned, range depending on program from about $1 to $6 for every dollar invested, is that that's going to take. It's not going to be an overnight return. You know, as I believe Alan mentioned, some of these programs will in theory reduce the need for health system use of the health system, reduce the need for criminal justice system use, and result in increased earnings. And so that's going to take sometimes decades to realize the benefit of that. And I'd say one more thing. ROI is thrown around a lot, and a lot of people use a number that was put out by a researcher named James Heckman on some very good programs. Perry Preschool program is one of those. Absidarian is another early childhood program, and those programs taught us a lot about what works in terms of early childhood education, as far as curriculum, et cetera. But they're also different programs. And so, you know, the Absidarian or Perry Preschool program is going to be a different type of return on investment versus our state-run pre-K program versus our child care program versus our Head Start program.
And one additional thing I'll add just about the figures. So the figures that were presented reflect only the permanent fund itself. So it cannot, in and of itself, that particular analysis can't include any of this return on investment from early childhood, because it only considers contributions and earnings of the fund. So the fund only receives contributions mostly from oil and gas royalty production, which would be largely unaffected by any increased spending, as well as interest earnings on the fund, which are separate from the spending of it. So this is only looking at the fund itself, what its return is under one distribution scenario over the return or the earnings and the return to the general fund over a different distribution scenario. So no, the analysis doesn't consider cost to or effect on the general fund of any ROI. This is looking at the permanent fund distribution itself. One thing that I will point out about the permanent fund, in terms of its long-term sustainability, as oil and gas operations eventually decrease over time, contributions into the fund decrease over time. But not only that, general fund contributions from oil and gas earnings, which are currently over 30% of the general fund, is dependent on current oil and gas activity. That's going to decline over time as well as oil and gas starts to phase out in the long run. And the permanent fund distributions are also intended to help supplant the loss of future general fund earnings from reduced oil and gas activity. So I'll just make that point of clarification in terms of the long-term growth is expected to diminish over time in terms of its contributions. Our current models expect future growth, the average annual growth of the fund itself, even under the current 5% distribution, the fund's only expected to grow about 3% a year. We're expecting fewer oil and gas contributions and a low interest earning environment. So just one point of clarification.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dawn. And just know that we'll have a more fuller conversation about this moving forward, knowing that it's almost like we've stepped back in time and we're talking about public education, right? The days when we were trying to figure out how we can have actual public education, and these similar arguments probably came up regarding money. and not really looking at the investment in the people of New Mexico, right? And so how we move forward, we probably need to think of it in that way. It will happen. There will be pre-K to 20 one-day free. We're just in a process, and it's a problem-solving process, right, of trying to make that happen. And so we as a collective, and not just individuals on one side or the other, we as a collective have to problem solve out of this, right? Knowing that it will happen, and we want to be on the right side of history when it happens, right? We want to figure this out together. So know that this will be continued. This is definitely for us to mull over, and we really appreciate everything that's been shared. We do have another speaker, and so I really want to honor her time. And so we are going to switch gears a little bit and have a conversation about teacher licensure. And if Shauna Flanagan could take it from here. Thank you.
Sorry, needed to unmute myself. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here and share with you a little bit about teacher licensure. It's a huge topic, and so I'll have a few points to talk about. I'm sure there'll be some questions, and happy to follow up afterwards or join the group again if that's a necessity. So my name's Shauna Flanagan, and I am the Division Director for Educator Quality at the New Mexico Public Education Department. My division oversees what you might refer to as the teacher ecosystem. So we start with work with pipelines for teacher education, pathways, and work with our preparation programs, both traditional and alternative. The Licensure Bureau falls under my purview, which is what we're here to talk about today. And then our Educator Growth and Development Bureau, which supports all licensed educators in the state, not just teachers, through our Title II grant, as well as continuing to build out supports for teachers, administrators, and other positions around the state, and look at how we can build out and support professional development around the state. So those are the big buckets of work that fall under my division. And that's my contact information there, should you want to be able to get in touch with me. So let's see. When I was invited to the meeting, I was asked to talk a little bit about what governs teacher licensure requirements and how changes to these are made. And I think there were some questions about multicultural education. So teacher licensure requirements and all requirements for licensed professionals within schools in New Mexico are governed by the New Mexico Statute 2210A, which is the School Personnel Act. One specific statute that I think will have, where we might gain more questions, is the educational requirements for licensure, and that's 2210A6. And that statute outlines minimum requirements for any person seeking a teaching license, whether it be through a traditional or alternative program. This statute was updated in 2015, and it speaks to really, first off, what needs to be considered through coursework taken at the College of Arts and Sciences prior to entering a program for education, for teaching licensure. And then from statute, administrative code, Chapter 61, 64, and 65 are ones that specifically speak to teacher licensure, though anything in the chapters 60 through 69 are where we see everything that governs the work that we do. So any large changes to what we look at for teacher licensure would happen through legislation. So if we were looking at changing educational requirements for entry into a program for teacher licensure, or looking at changing required courses as part of an education program, so as part of a program where someone is seeking teacher licensure, that would happen through statute to ensure consistency across all of the educator preparation programs in the state that we're working with. And then from there, any of those smaller changes would happen through rule change. So if we were looking at perhaps making an update to certain competencies for a specific type of license or type of an endorsement on a teaching license, that would happen through rule change process, which would require the department to partner with educators and interested stakeholders across the state to look at language in current rule, how it's aligned to statute, and where we would see important changes being made. And then the rulemaking process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but just in case, the changes to a draft would be made, they'd be posted for public comment. We would have in-person comment, or in the days of COVID, we would have Zoom comment. And then the proposals would go into place once all feedback had been considered. One of the things that's very important to this current administration at the department is that we take a deep dive into all of our licensure statute and rule to see where we can make improvements to both continue to ensure that our teacher candidates, so our future teachers, are going through a rigorous process, but where can we remove roadblocks that may be blocking people from getting into the classroom and being able to support all students to ensure that they're getting a quality education from a teacher who is highly qualified to teach their subject and offering a very effective education for all students. And so I've been tasked with looking through all of our code that we currently have and its alignment to statute to see where we can start to pull out some key rule, where we can make some changes and be able to partner with certain groups to get updates that are going to streamline the process to the classroom to ensure that we have great educators out there in all of our classrooms. One of the specific questions too that came through in the email invitation was around I'm assuming it just was it's just said about classes titled ethnic studies, and my interpretation of that question, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, was do our educator preparation programs, so the programs that we have our teacher candidates going through, do they have requirements for ethnic studies? And while all of our educator preparation programs do have coursework in multiculturalism as well as diversity courses, there's nothing specifically titled ethnic studies that any of our programs are currently offering. And I can always get additional information from each of the preparation programs around their course offerings for their diversity and multicultural course offerings. But we do know anecdotally that that's an area where we still have opportunity as a state to ensure that our teacher candidates are better prepared to address diverse needs of all of their students in the classroom. And as we continue to look at not only our preparation programs, but our ability to offer statewide professional development and supports for teachers throughout their careers, that is another place where we can focus our efforts in that. I'm gonna just stop the share so I can see everybody's faces. And so I know we have, I wanted to make sure I left time for questions because I know that licensure is a huge topic And it's something that I could spend days and days talking about, but want to make sure that I address with all of you specific questions you might have about process or things that are already in place.
Thanks. I have one question. Continuing education, what are the requirements for the continuing education for keeping licenses?
Great question, Amy. Currently, New Mexico does not have any requirements for continuing education for keeping your license. So New Mexico has a 3-tiered licensure system. A level 1 license is a provisional license that all teachers start out with. It's a 5-year license and must be moved to a level 2 license between year 3 and year 5 of teaching. To do that, an educator completes a professional development dossier of their work, which is then reviewed by their district and by outside reviewers and scored. And if it's passed, they're issued their level 2 license. Once an educator reaches a level 2 license, that's a 9-year license, and it can be renewed every 9 years currently without any requirements for any kind of continuing education or specific professional development. And an educator can keep their level 2 license forever, never having to move up to a level 3. And currently the only requirement is that they renew it every 9 years. They can also choose to move to a level 3 license, and that is the highest level of teacher license. There's 2 pathways to move to that. One is they have to teach for a minimum of 3 years on their level 2 license, earn a master's degree in any field, and then complete another dossier that's reviewed by their district and scored by outside reviewers. The other way to move to a level 3 license from level 2, again, you have to teach a minimum of 3 years on your level 2 license, and then complete a national board certification through the National Board for Certified Teachers. It is a rigorous program that some say is more rigorous than completing a master's degree. And through that process, the educator works to provide videos of their teaching, completes different strands of work that are required by the National Board Certification to move up to level 3A. And so if they choose to do that, the master's degree is not required. This year, the legislature passed and provided funding to the Public Education Department to offer scholarships to level 2 teachers that wanted to pursue National Board Certification. And so we're currently in the process of receiving those applications from teachers and awarding those scholarships. What other questions are there?
Questions, folks?
If someone else has questions, I have questions.
Go, Amy.
I don't want to take up all the space. So I think we all see with our children that they get days off for teacher in-service days.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no requirement to maintain your license, what is a teacher in-service day? Exactly where does that play into licensure?
Sure. So the teacher in-service days are used by the different districts and state charter schools to provide professional development to their educators. These can be things that are specific to that school and or district, goals that they may have that they're focusing on. It could be in regards to a state initiative, but currently the only way that has any necessarily impact on a teacher is through the teacher evaluation process. They have the opportunity to upload and share data on professionalism and professional development of how they're growing themselves in the profession. But as a state, we haven't adopted anything where we would then turn that into something that you would use to advance your license. Now, as we take a look at licensure statute and rule. It is an area where we have opportunity as a state. Many states do require certain continuing education credits for an educator to be able to renew and sustain their license in that state. And we have begun to have those internal conversations at the department about what could that look like for New Mexico? What should that look like for New Mexico? And what, what would be most meaningful, not only for the educator, because we do want to ensure that the professional development and any CEUs that would be required are things that are meaningful and not just something to tick a box for our educators, but also what impact is that going to have on our students? So if we know that a certain percentage of our educators are struggling to address the diversity of the needs of their students in the classroom, whether it be learning needs or other needs, how do we then weave that into their ability to renew their license, their ability to advance their license? So those are things that we're already talking about.
And then is the special education licensure different than just teacher licensure?
So in New Mexico, special education is its own separate license. In some states, it's an endorsement on a regular license, but here in New Mexico, it's its own separate license. And so educators pursuing a special education license would go through either a traditional or alternative educator program to obtain their special education license. The special education license in New Mexico is a PK through 12 license. So it covers all grade levels, right? Some states do have special education licenses that are chunked into different grade levels. So you might complete a program that is specifically to address special education in the earlier grades, special education in the middle grades, special education in the upper grades. It's my understanding that we have the special education license set the way we do based on the needs of the state. And so for some of our smaller, more rural districts and smaller charter schools, having one or two special education teachers who can cover the whole grade level spread would be easier staffing wise than it would be to try to find people to work in the chunked grades. And there has been discussion about, do we need to look at that licensure differently as well, to make sure that we are meeting the needs at each age group that can differ, and also allowing an educator to really hone in and perfect their skills because of even the diverse range of the needs of our special education students. We have that conversation about general education as well at the secondary level. All of our math and science endorsements are just an endorsement in math or an endorsement in science. And you might have somebody who has their math endorsement that has a degree in calculus, but is never taught, but doesn't know algebra as well, or can't teach algebra as well. And so we've talked about, do we need to look at more specifics around that as well? And again, it goes back to some of our smaller rural districts and ensuring we're meeting that, balancing meeting the needs of the school, the students, and the educators. And so that becomes a tricky balancing act.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Sina, I think you sort of mentioned it, but I sort of missed it, I think. As a Racial Justice Council, we want to put an equity lens on everything. So where is the equity lens in teacher licensure? How do we assure ourselves that teachers in New Mexico, acknowledge the multicultural community that they are serving, and that they will serve all of us equitably? So is there I think you sort of mentioned it, but you sort of like went over it really fast, and I don't know if it's there and it might be too difficult, but how do we assure that a certified teacher in New Mexico understands the population she or he is serving?
Great question. I did touch on it a little bit, but I do feel like it's an area where, as a state, we have a huge opportunity for growth, to be perfectly honest. Our preparation programs do include coursework on multiculturalism, and they do include coursework on culturally and linguistic responsive educational practices, but there is absolutely more that could and should be done. It is something from a department level that we're looking at through a professional development lens, and how can we help get professional learning out there in a way for all teachers to be able to take advantage of and become better advocates and better learners about what's happening in our state and who our students are and who all of our people are, and that is a huge opportunity. You know, there will always be an excuse that something will get in the way, and for this is so important that we have to stop those excuses of, well, this is more important or this is more important. No, actually, this is important because this touches on everything across the board. So while it's happening in buckets in our programs and in some districts through the professional learning that they're doing with their teachers and school leaders, it's not happening consistently as a state. And it's somewhere where I think the department could probably use some support as well to help have a little bit of a push behind it to see how important it is, and not just something, again, that's ticking a box to say, yes, we required this, and yes, everybody did this, but more so, yes, everybody did this, and here's how they're practicing it now when they're in their classrooms with their students, or when they're in their communities speaking to parents and families. It's all well and good for us to say they took the class, but having that ability to then show how it's happening in practice is what we need as well.
And Shauna, just on that note, it makes me think of some of the language that we used at UNM regarding a demonstrated commitment to equity and inclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was for hiring practices and other spaces and places. But if you're talking the tier system, right, at some point, they've got to demonstrate their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that would help them show it in a very tangible way instead of just a theoretical, abstract way.
Yes.
And so to use that kind of language in there makes the most sense. And I wonder what the connection is between that conversation and the ethnic studies bill that was proposed a few years back. I think we have Senator Lopez here. So if we can make some connection there as well of how, you know, it, like one of the things we're trying to do is to see how certain bills that were already proposed, or certain policies or practices within departments that were already in place, can be tweaked or adjusted, right? To have that racial justice lens. And so suggestions along those lines would be great, right? From you or others. How can we make some of those changes?
I think especially through the tiered process, I think that's where we really do have an opportunity to make some tweaks to that system. And I'm not sure, and perhaps Senator Lopez, she'll probably know better than I, but as we look at the tiered system, which is detailed in statute, is there room for us to tweak that process of advancement away from a dossier of work to require, you know, something different, or some different steps along the way? So as you're completing your first 3 years of level 1 teaching, here are specific professional development or coursework that you need to complete during that time to be ready to move to level 2. And then you're demonstrating these pieces of the work. So I think that we do have the opportunity through our tiered licensure system to work to make some of these changes so that they are there in practice, that they are tangible and not just in the theoretical.
Mm-hmm. And then do people want to add? Do you add to that part of the conversation or other?
I mean, I think, Shauna, what I want to ask you is because, you know, we have this very great opportunity right now to move forward things through either statute or rules. And I really appreciated your slide, how you talked about statute or rules. And I think many of us are feeling like we don't want rules because statute puts things in permanently and rules can be changed. But also at the same time, rules are a very quick win. And that maybe we can get that rule in and then move to statute in the following years. So I guess I want to ask and not put you on the spot in any way to give, you know, immediate, you know, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I do want to ask your suggestion about what would be the best way for us to, because if I'm reading our group correctly, we want to, one, require that our students go through ethnic studies, but two, that our teachers have some sort of anti-racism credential in order to get licensed. And then three, I think we want to look very specifically at our special education teachers, particularly around what we heard at the council, the main council. I'm sorry, she sees a cat. We really want to look at how, you know, because so many of our children of color are either diagnosed or, you know, put into spaces where they are special ed students, or maybe they do need to be special ed students and are not getting the help that they need in order to, because they're not tested or something like that, that special ed certifications need an even higher level of anti-racism. I don't want to say training because I just really, generally, I think training is this kind of one and done thing. And when you're talking about checking boxes, that feels really uncomfortable to me. But I do think we want to look at some sort of certification or, as Kieran was saying, right, like how do you show a dedication to being anti-racism? And so those are the things that we as a subcommittee and then the larger council have also talked about. What would you give us as a recommendation for how we can move that through the rules process so that we can kind of get this a quick win that maybe then we can go through statute. If it doesn't pass this session, we can keep trying later, but we have the rules in place already.
I think that I would look at the, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but the rule for licensure advancement and the requirements there, as well as looking at the Chapter 61 in NMAC, which is specific licensure requirements for instructors. So that's entry requirements as well. I think in both of those places, we would have opportunity in rule to layer in anti-racist professional learning, and not just a one and done, because I agree with you when you say training, that does sound like one and done, and professional learning can as well. But what does that ongoing professional learning look like? Is it a building of a micro-credential that an educator, you know, a level 1 educator has to finish in their first year of teaching? Because one thing I do know is to change anything at the educator preparation program level is much more of a heavy lift, because they have kids that are already in programs. And so if you change the playing field in the middle, that's not fair to them. So what is it, something that we look at that during your first year on your level 1 license, you need to go through this professional learning, and this is what it looks like, and it's hosted by the either the department, or maybe we involve our regional education cooperative, something like that. But I think that those are two places where we could probably get a quick win that would also be something that the department could, I don't want to say easily, but would be able to find a way to build out specifically on the new learning management system that we have in place that all educators across the state have access to. Does that make sense? Okay.
Just back to the credentialing, Shona.
Yes.
It seems that when we credential, and we see this in the public schooling system, there's sort of a siloing, right? And people are like, oh no, she's the one that does that, right?
Yes.
Instead of it being everyone's responsibility and how to have it almost valued, you know, at a level of like, this is what we do in education. And so any suggestions from anyone regarding how to bring that about? What are the processes for making sure that as teachers are getting their degrees, this is just the norm?
I think that, Kiran, that's a great question, but I always want us to remember our circle of influence, right? And so as much as I would love for the governor to be able to dictate what our school preparation is, I don't think that's our circle of influence, or at least, you know, I could be wrong. We can talk about that more. But I think, so Shauna, we do have a work group on racial equity requirements in hiring and training. I think that work group would love to have further conversation with you. I really appreciate you coming today. Kiran, can we open with that question in the next subcommittee meeting, right? Is that I think, you know, we do have these circles of influence, but I also think that one of the things that I recently talked with the governor about is that even though she doesn't have a circle of influence, and you know, there are some things that she can't just, like, she cannot mandate Albuquerque Police Department to do certain things, or she cannot mandate NMSU to add this class to their curriculum. But that what she can do is create some incentive for, you know, peer competitiveness, right? You know, here's what the state police are doing, so maybe you want to do that, or here's what PED is doing, so maybe you want to do that. And so let's open with that next, that question that you just had. Let's open with that next. Actually, Tammy, who's coming to present next time? Do we have that yet?
While she's looking, let me just say, Amy, I agree with you, but in terms of the governor, I think there are some things that we can ask the governor, and that is that she has to use her own language, because words matter. I've never heard her talk about an equity lens when she talks out in public. I've never heard her talk about the fact that New Mexico is a multicultural, multilingual state. She has to use those words because that's coming from the top. And so, you know, the thing is, and all our legislators, I mean, we talk education. So it becomes a generic word that means the same thing that it's meant for the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. We need to learn to use words properly. And every time that we use the word education, we need to say the multicultural, multilingual, educational population that we serve. We are a multicultural, multilingual state. We are on and on and on. Words matter. And they have to start with the governor, and we have to ask her to use those words.
Alvina,
Elisa, what working group are you on? Are you on a working group yet?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
I'm on the education subcommittee, that's all.
Okay. I'm going to email you and we're going to have a conversation, okay?
Okay.
And we do not have our speaker set up for our next meeting yet. It's still pending.
Okay, so Kiran, let's start next subcommittee with your question. Let's open up with that. Let's come up with some ideas. And Elisa, your comment right there is definitely going to need to be on the table for those ideas of what kinds of things can we suggest to the governor that aren't rules, that aren't statute, but that still create a culture of racial equity in our state, right? And again, these are suggestions, you know, that we're going to give to the governor. They're not guaranteed, but I don't think that we should miss the opportunity in, you know, today's current climate to really be able to put those things forward, right? I see that we're past our time already. Shauna, thank you so much for coming. Sorry for the overtime in the previous reports. Also, thank you guys so much for the space that you guys gave to the Legislative Fund. For those of you who have not wanted to be on, who have not selected to be on a working group yet, please let me know if there's a working group that you are interested in being on. The Permanent Land Fund is one of those groups. The Racial Equity, I believe I sent them to you. So thanks so much for your time. Senator Lopez, I'm going to go ahead and let folks know what we were privately chatting about here. Senator Lopez is going to be putting out her bill again for the requirement for ethnic studies courses in our high school. So she's going to share that draft with us, or the bill from last year. We are anxiously awaiting that. This group has been very excited about that as a suggestion we can move forward. So happy Thursday, you all. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you in 2 weeks if we don't see you before then.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.